everybody. So today we're going to do the gender lecture part 2, and that's going to be a bunch of terminology. So bear with me because these are a lot of words, a lot of concepts, and I want to make sure we have a good grasp of them. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to start with some terminology about just in general gender terms that you should probably know. So intersex is that category that refers to those whose sex do not fit into the characteristics of male and female based on, again, chromosome levels, hormone levels, or anatomic features. And we kind of talked about that in the first slide when we talked about how sex is not binary. Gender identity is the personal understanding, experience, and performance of gender. So someone is going to claim what it is that they feel best describes them, and it may not be a category at all. It may be a refusal to want to be categorized, and that in and of itself is valid as well. Cis or cisgender is someone whose self-identity confirms to their assigned gender at birth. So your assigned gender at birth is that male or female marker that you get on your birth certificate, devoid of really any idea of who you are going to be as a human as you grow and develop and learn and how to be human, right? So when you are a cisgender person or a cis person, those are the same. You'll hear me use them interchangeably. It's just an abbreviation essentially. But that person is going to be the same as that marker that is on that, or feel like they are the same as that marker that is on that birth certificate. And a trans or transgender person refers to people whose gender identity is inconsistent with their assigned sex at birth. Now, again, remember that this is also an umbrella, can be an umbrella term, especially academically. It's used as an umbrella term for most non-binary or non-conforming persons, but understand that there's a lot of variation in that, and there's a lot of gender non-conforming persons that do not want to be considered trans, and there's a lot of trans persons who don't feel like they're gender non-conforming. They feel like they are very adamant in their gender as where it does not apply to their sex that they were assigned at birth. Their gender itself fits into that male or female binary. And so as a trans person, you can feel that way, or you can also claim that label as somebody who does not feel like you fit into one of those two boxes. So just to be clear, that can be an umbrella term, but in a lot of cases for trans persons, they are very adamantly or vehemently arguing that they fit into that binary, just not as it was assigned to them at birth. Okay. Gender nonconforming. This is, again, one of those umbrella terms for any of those people who actively choose to express their gender in ways that do not adhere to social expectations of male or female. And can be cis and still queer your gender expression through, though this is typically a term that is used for those who wish to be outside of the gender binary construction or the sex binary construction. See also gender queer, gender bending, and gender varying. So in this case, it's more about I either A, don't want the labels, B, I don't fit in either one of these labels, C, I think these labels are dumb and I fit mostly in one, but I like to feel like I can be me in any way. Or it's more of an androgynous term where they're like, I fit everywhere, I'm rocking it out, leave me be. Okay, so and that can be something like, again, you can be gender nonconforming just in the general sense of like, hey, I feel very feminine in this, but I like to present myself in very short haircuts with the masculine clothing, feel very comfortable with bigger, more bulging muscles, those kind of things, which are typically considered more masculine. Can also be, I express my gender in very masculine ways. I am a very assertive person, or I am very loud. I am very outgoing. I am very sporty. I am very, all of these things can be considered gender nonconforming, but for the most part, the people that self-identify as gender nonconforming are those who choose to kind of be outside of that gender binary construction, if that makes sense. Androgyny is someone who chooses an appearance and or mannerisms that express both masculine and feminine presentations. And you're going to see a lot of androgyny when you look at maybe like K-pop stars, or when you look at maybe I'm trying to think of so maybe you see it a lot in high fashion too, where there's very androgynous haircuts, very androgynous facial features, very androgynous clothing, where it's intentional that you are bending or intentionally not gearing towards one specific box in a way that makes it very easy to categorize someone. And then we're going to get into some concepts, maybe, if this will. There we go. Okay, so we're going to do some more gender specific words. So you're going to have gender queer, see also gender nonconforming. This is, again, just another term that really is talking about the way in which we queer or change or manipulate the way gender is done. And that is intentional, right? Generally, being gender queer, you are intentionally queering your gender. You're intentionally living outside of that normative for your gender. And that's where you want to be, because you want to assert that that categorization system or that category doesn't fit you. Gender fluid is someone who identifies their gender as fluid, depending on time, space, interaction, or choice. So this can be something where it can be as simple as, I feel like I flow very within masculine and feminine presentations very regularly, and I switch that up and I feel very comfortable in both. It can be something as, I don't feel feminine today, and so I would rather take masculine pronouns. It is intentionally saying that gender is fluid for me. I recognize that, and I want you to recognize that too. And gender is fluid to an extent for all of us, right? I don't wear the pink frilly dresses that they put me in as a baby. I don't do that intentionally. Why? Because that wasn't my choice. I don't wear makeup intentionally as a choice, mostly because my skin hates it, but also because that's not the presentation that I want to have. We all bend our gender in ways that we are comfortable with. So while I don't wear makeup, I have a very feminine hairstyle, and then it is very long. It is very, like, it's put up in strategically feminine ways. There are ways in which we bend and curve and reconstruct those rules to fit what it is that we feel like best represents us. And I think that understanding that helps us to understand how gender is constructed and socially constructed, right? So as a woman who is home at the end of the day, chooses to take their bra off, take off their makeup, take down their hair, sit in sweatpants, eat their ice cream, watch some shows, chill out, that woman is going to change how they present themselves. If they're going to go out on a date for the first time, they're going to get possibly all dolled up, dressed to the nine, looking like they mean it. And those two presentations don't make that person any different, but they're presenting their gender in very distinctly different ways. And that's what we mean by the fact that gender is socially constructed. If that person who's sitting on their couch by themselves was innately and inherently looking the same as they did going out on a date, trying to present themselves in a particular way in that interaction all the time, then we could maybe have more of a conversation about what is inherent. But the fact that we don't means that that interaction in and of itself is changing how we are presenting ourselves. All right, so our next one is non-binary. Again, it's someone who identifies their gender as intentionally outside of the male and female social binary. And often this identity is an expression of a desire not to have their gender boxed into any category. And again, so you're going to see gender fluid, gender queer, non-binary, androgynous, all of these things fitting again into that gender non-conforming bucket, and making sure that all of these things can mean different things for different people, but just go by whatever it is that they consider themselves, because that identity and some of these terms are structured age-wise. So some of them are generational. Some of these terms are relatively newer. Some of these terms are more academic. And some of these distinctions are very, very, very minute. And it's not something that I'm ever going to ask you to be like, pick the difference. What makes the difference between these particular things? I want you to understand the general concept. I don't want you to sit there and nitpick about what makes each distinct category or naming of categories different, because that's the whole point, is not to do that. Agender is a person that considers themselves without gender or without a gender category. And so an agender person is going to be somebody who's like, no, just no. And they're going to consider themselves, they might look very androgynous or they might not. The point here for them is that gender is not a category that they are going to inherently put themselves into, and they just don't want a box or don't have a box that adequately fits them. And so they consider themselves without gender, if that makes sense. Or it's not something that they think is high on their identity priority list. And so it's not something that defines them. Bigender is a person that considers themselves with two different genders, and two different genders do not have to be male and female. So you can have someone who is bigender that is female and gender nonconforming or non-binary. It just means that they pass through these particular sections, and these particular sections feel the most correct to them. And it's honestly not a term that I hear a whole lot, but it is a term that is used in academia to, again, put those categories and be able to measure things that we like to measure in human existence. Third gender is a social category in which an individual can represent gender in a variety of ways. An interdependent state between masculine and feminine. It is neither gender as a category to swap genders, or another category altogether independent of the binary categories. So third gender is very similar to non-binary. The distinction here for third gender is that generally it has to deal with a culture that is outside of Eurocentric cultures. And usually these cultures are more indigenous cultures, and they have a very different religious framework surrounding what it means to be third gender. And you're going to see some other terms down there. Now, remember that depending on the generation, some of those terms can be offensive. So make sure that you are using a term that that person labels for themselves, not a term that you label someone else. And then we have two-spirit, which is a term used by some indigenous persons who consider themselves of third gender. And it is typically considered positively within the culture and attributed to increased spirituality. And you see this a lot in North American indigenous cultures. All right, let me see if we have any more. Okay, we got a couple more. I know this is a lot, and I am sorry, you guys will get it. Make sure you can rewind, fast forward, do whatever you need to do. The reason I put the definitions in the slides and they have so much words is so that you can go back to the slides and think about kind of what I said, but it is a lot of information, and I recognize that. The gender binary system is a system of gender that categorizes or that asserts male and female as the only options and ostracizes those who don't fit in within that framework. A gender role is the social expectation that people will participate in gender activities, behaviors, attitudes aligned with their assigned sex at birth. Transitions is the process by which someone steers away from the sex assigned at birth towards a version of themselves that feels more accurate, fulfilling, and or representative. This does not always include physical changes, but it can. So you can transition with social changes, things like your name, things like your pronouns, things like your appearance. You can transition based on interactions, based on your social relationships, or you can transition more physically with things like binding, with things like surgical procedures, with things like top surgery or bottom surgery, and or hormone therapy and or hormone blockers. There's a lot of ways in which you can medically and or socially transition, and all of those things are part of that transitioning process. Masculinity is the perceived and described behaviors, practices, mannerism, and expectations for those who are assumed or identify as male. And you have several different kinds of masculinity, which I actually am going to start in the next lecture so that we don't have that moment of like, holy crap, this is too much. And then there's femininity, which is the perceived and ascribed behaviors, practices, mannerisms, and expectations for those who are assumed or identify as female. And we're going to get into those different femininities here in just 1 second as well. So I'm going to go ahead and end there for this lecture, and then we're going to get into masculinity and femininity here in just a bit. I hope you're doing okay. Again, feel free to ask questions. This is a lot of information and a lot of terminology, but I do think that this terminology is important for all of us to learn, and it helps us to make sure we make the proper choices when we're interacting with other people about their gender.